I really am very pleased to be back here. I was here just before the lockdown kicked in the last time, speaking to the sub-35 class one evening. I'm very honoured, actually. Sometimes I've even recently been on a sub-25 retreat, which might seem a bit of an anomaly, but they needed an order member at the last minute to go along because the events are run by the Mitras at the LBC, and there's 50 sub-25ers going on this retreat at Parinirvana, our retreat centre. And they always have to have an order member at hand just in case they get into difficulties. And the order member who's supposed to go suddenly was ill and couldn't go. So the first port of call was me, because I've got a reputation for standing in at the last minute under all circumstances. So I had 2 hours to get ready, and off I went to the sub-25 retreat. And I apologised profusely because I said, look, you know, I'd be very lucky to scrape into a sub-75 group. I'm getting on in years, you see, but they knew perfectly well I could see that. But it was wonderful, actually, a really wonderful weekend, for me at least, if not for them. I mean, I love being with young people. I live with 11 of them. In fact, I'm more than twice the age of the next youngest member of my community, which is interesting. And yesterday morning, I was speaking with Claudio, who's a Portuguese background, and he said to me, Devamitra, this was early in the morning, he said, Devamitra, I dreamt about you last night. I said, of course, well, naturally, I said, I hope it wasn't a nightmare. He assured me that it wasn't, but apparently it wasn't very pleasant. And he said that in this dream, we'd been in the community was away somewhere together, and I was with them all. And he said, in the course of the dream, I had said to the entire community that this evening would be the last evening I'd go to sleep. I thought, how wonderful. What a way to fall off your perch, you know, in bed, asleep, as it were. And I also took it to be quite auspicious, knowing, of course, that the following day, today, I would be here commemorating, or helping you to commemorate, the final passing of the Buddha. So let's go back to that. Let's start at the beginning. I wanted in this talk to take us right back to the very beginning, in fact, of the Buddha's, well, I don't know what you would call it, let's say his journey in his final life, which I would consider to be the 4 sites. Some of you will be familiar with those. I hope all of you are, but I'll just remind you what they are in a moment. But according to the traditional account, the young Prince Siddhartha, on one occasion, went out and saw, seemingly for the first time, a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. And so this is the starting point of his journey, which, of course, according to the traditional account, culminates. Well, basically, he was so moved by what he saw. Apparently, he hadn't seen an old man or a sick man or a dead man before. I don't know whether he's seen an ascetic before, but he was seeing them for the first time, and it strongly affected him. And it was the trigger, if you like, to him leaving home, going forth, and gaining enlightenment, according to the traditional account, 6 years later. So he left home at the age of 29. Certainly that's the traditional account, but apparently recently there's been doubts cast upon that, because the very earliest text that we have suggested he was a much younger man than a 29-year-old. In one text, the Babanja Sutta, which is one of the oldest texts that we have, the young prince is described as a youth in his heyday prime, according to the translation that I'm most familiar with, So a man of 29 is not a youth. I hope no one's being offended. But if you're 29, you're no longer a youth. You might get away with it if you're 20, but even then, I'm not sure. So maybe the Buddha was actually much younger when he went forth than the traditional account tells us. Certainly, the account in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta also suggests, for example, that there's no mention of a wife and son, which is part of what we're told that the Buddha left home. He left a wife and a son behind. But there's no mention in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, which is his own account of his going forth. All that's mentioned are his aged and grieving parents. And the earliest representations of the Buddha's going forth, in fact, just show his parents. They don't show a wife and son. So it's quite possible that, for reasons which I'm not going to go into, the Buddha never had a wife and never had a son. We don't know, but it's a possibility. Anyway, coming back to my first point, the Buddha was clearly very young when he left home. He may even have been in his late teens. It's not out of the question. And I find it therefore all the more remarkable that at such a tender age, he was able to see the significance of old age, sickness, and death. He's also able to see beyond that, because that's what the wandering ascetic represents. It represents the possibility, in the Buddha's imagination at least, or the future Buddha's imagination, of a way out of these existential problems that we all have to face. We grow old, we get sick, and we die. Well, I've certainly grown old. I've gotten sick, and who knows how much longer I shall live. I don't. I mean, none of us do, of course. We can never know that, but probably not that much longer. So these are slowly becoming realities for me in a deeper way than they were even, I would say, 5 years ago before I was diagnosed with cancer. But for a young man, even, let alone a youth, to see the significance of these things and seek a way beyond them is quite remarkable, and indicates just what a positive youth he was, that he had that he was able to sort of take that in and not in any way seemingly be distressed by it. He just saw its significance. And he understood that this surely is not all there is to life. And so begins his quest for the deathless. But it's the sight especially of of age, sickness, and death, which I wanted to sort of bring in, really. Not that the other sight was unimportant. Clearly, it was very important indeed. It was quite visionary. But for me, there's a connection here with the Parinirvana, because he sees old age, sickness, and death. At the time of his passing away, of course, he's not just seeing them, he's actually experiencing old age, sickness, and he's about to die. And it's of course his passing away that we're commemorating today. But it begins, I think that whole journey, as far as I'm concerned at least, begins with those sights. Now, old age, sickness, and death afflicts us all, whether we like it or not, whether we really take that in or not. I think most of the time we don't really take cognizance of that fact, or those facts. They are the harsh realities, the harder realities, let's say, of human existence, even of sentient existence. And of course, occasionally, death may impinge upon us. It may impinge upon us through, on such occasions when we lose someone near and dear to us. I remember the first time that I encountered death. I was 7 years old, and it was my great-grandfather who died. And that meant nothing to me. I went into the room into which I'd been forbidden to go because I was so curious where his coffin was lying and where he was lying in there, dead, of course. But I looked at him, I knew him, but it didn't mean anything to me that there was a dead body. But when my grandmother, who I was very close to, died 10 years later, I really felt it. It was like suddenly I'd awakened to life. But then, of course, we forget. We forget that we're going to die. We forget even that other people are going to die, those who are close to us, and that they could go at any time. But until, of course, it happens. And then you remember. We're brought back to reality, the fact that ultimately we're all going to die. So, of course, since my grandmother died, I've had many bereavements. I imagine everyone present has had some bereavement or other, apart from the baby in arms over there. These things, we tend to forget them, even if we from time to time meditate upon death and impermanence, which some of you may have done. I imagine certainly the order members will have done. I must say, when I was diagnosed with cancer, it was quite a shock, because I wasn't expecting it. Why on earth I wasn't expecting it, I don't know. I was 68. When you grow old, you get sick. This is what the Buddha said. This is what happened to him. He was sick in the final years. We don't know to what extent he was sick, but he certainly was. He speaks about it in the sutta that Laltaraja was reading from earlier, that he was sick, but he was able, by some force of his will, I assume, to suppress the pain. And that was his experience. And he said that, again, in the same sutta, that my body has grown old. And he likened it to an old rickety cart, which was held together by bits of string. And, I'm beginning to know what that feels like. When you get old, the body does slowly go its own way. It begins to decay, bit by bit. I'm losing my hearing, very common at my age. My sense of balance is precarious, like many of my contemporaries. You lose your sense of balance when you get old. Most young people are not aware of this, but it just happens bit by bit. And I began to notice this more seriously about a couple of years ago. So now I have to do balance exercises every day, just to try and maintain an upright posture as best I can. Someone I was ordained with, I was on a retreat with him recently, and he got up from his meditation at the end and fell headlong right across the shrine, banged, there was a pillar in the shrine, and knocked the pillar and made a heck of a clatter. He too is getting old, same age as me actually. So there you go. He was flat on his face. And I spoke to him afterwards. I said, "Look, don't you do balance exercises?" He said, "Well, I have I have the equipment. I just keep forgetting to use it." But I think this is the sort of thing that happens when you get old. You lose your balance. You slowly lose your faculties, your hearing, your sight becomes less clear, and so on and so forth. At least these are some of the things that are happening to me. I won't bore you with all the details. Old folks can go on for so long about their minor ailments. I think you've had enough of them already. Let's not go into that. But the Buddha, as he approached the end of his life, certainly experienced pain, intense pain. He spoke of very intense pain, in fact. But somehow he's able to rise above it and not let that pain disrupt what he had to do. So shortly before the Buddha did pass away, he took his final meal, which was served to him by a man called Kunda. And the Buddha knew perfectly well that if he ate that meal, it would make him sick, which it did. But actually, I've just lost my thread a little bit. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's something else that happened before that, which is important that I should mention. Now it's gone out of my mind again. See what it's like to get old. Short-term memory is lousy. It was in my mind as I was speaking, then suddenly it vanished. And just pause while to let it come back again. Otherwise we'll forget it. Oh yes, very, very important. The Parinirvana Sutta begins with a very important incident, which I should have mentioned earlier, as I said, and that is that the Buddha drops a big hint to Ananda that if requested, he could live to the end of the eon. I think it's the word, or the end of the world period, whatever that means, possibly an extra 20 years or something like that. But the Buddha has to be asked. And Ananda didn't pick up the hint, even though the Buddha mentioned this 3 times. As a consequence, the Buddha decided that he would not live out the eon. But before that, he was spoken to by Mara, the evil one, who was trying to encourage the Buddha to pass away. He said, look, you've done everything you set out. You've got a vibrant Sangha. The Dharma is widely known, widely practiced. People are communicating that. You said to me on one occasion, when that was done, you'd be happy to pass away. Give yourself a rest. The time has come for you to pass. The Buddha, of course, dismissed Mara. Let it be, Mara. The Buddha decides these things. Anyway, the Buddha did decide that the time had come for his own passing. And, of course, the earth shook. It was a significant event. The passing of a Buddha was marked even by nature. The earth shook, so the traditional account tells us. Whether or not we take that literally, clearly something significant had happened. And so then Ananda wants to know what was the significance of the earthquake. The Buddha tells him and mentions that he could have lived for an extra period, 20 years, however long it was, but he decided, no, the time has happened. The time has come for me to pass away. Of course, Ananda then requests the Buddha to live on. Too late. It's no use now. The Buddha's going to live for another 3 months. Because he wants to say goodbye to his disciples in the near area, not far from Kusinara, where he eventually passed away. And it was then, shortly before he did pass away, that Kunda served him this meal that he knew would cause him serious illness. And he describes the illness as inducing severe pain, a form of dysentery or something of that sort. He was able to suppress it by rising into the 4th dhyana, but nonetheless, there were times when he could not do that, and it affected him severely. So that's what happened. The Buddha takes his final meal and passes on. Well, he doesn't pass on immediately, but he becomes severely ill through this dysentery. And he tries to reassure, or he tells Ananda, make sure that Kunda doesn't feel that he was to blame for this. He was not. So that's the story up until the point of his actual final passing away. But I'd like to pause a bit and bring in some of my own recent experience in this regard, a bit more of it rather. I mentioned that I was quite shocked when I was diagnosed with cancer because I didn't expect that. The the cancer that I had was quite serious. I understood that immediately. My GP sort of referred me for an urgent appointment at the hospital that later treated me for suspected prostate cancer. But I could tell from the expression on her face that it was serious, and it wasn't just suspected cancer. She was convinced. I spoke to her about this a few meetings later, and she said, "Yes, I was convinced." But I knew immediately, and I knew at once that this meant that I had a battle ahead of me. But the battle was not with my body. The battle was with my mind. Because I understood immediately that the most important thing for me was to remain in the most positive frame of mind, the most positive mental state that I possibly could, and to try to sustain that. And that's what I did, especially through the whole period of my treatments, which were pretty severe. I managed to do that. And I was a little bit surprised at that. But on one occasion, I mean, I don't remember saying this, but I was interviewed by Stiramanus, who I live with, who was with me through that period. And he was interviewing me for the Buddhist Centre online on Monday night. And he said that he was quite shocked himself on one occasion when he asked how I was. And I said that I'd never been happier in my life. And this was when I was in the middle of chemotherapy, which is not a walk in the park, I can tell you. But that rings a vague bell. I don't remember saying it, but I can imagine I probably did. And that was because of the fact that I'd made a big effort to remain positive throughout. Not that I was denying the unpleasantness of my experience or anything of that sort, but I was able to do that. And I was able to do that because I'd been practicing the Dharma at that point for close on 50 years. Well, 45, let's say, at that stage. And I realized then just how strong the impact of the Dharma had been on my whole life. This is something that it's not easy to take in when you're in the middle when you're practicing year after year after year after year. It became apparent to me that the effects of my Dharma practice had been very, very strong over that period, but very, very slow and very subtle. And what I take from that is that if you're going to practice the Dharma, you have to be patient. If you keep practicing, it will bear fruit. But you may not see that fruit even in this lifetime. You may not see it for a very long time. But if you sustain it, those fruits will arise. And I felt that because of my experience with the cancer, well, I felt it before actually, because I did a long solitary retreat and I felt it then, but I felt it even more going through the treatment of the cancer because, on one level, I was very surprised that I was able to maintain my skillful mental states pretty much throughout. I really was surprised, but I wasn't surprised when I reflected upon it because of the amount of practice that I had done. So patience is really important if you're practicing the Dharma. Patience as opposed to complacency. It's very easy also to become complacent and think that you're making an effort when you're not, just by turning up occasionally to a class here or whatever. But no, it's not. Patience it's not the same as complacency. I'm not saying by just occasionally turning up for classes here that you are being complacent, but I just want to make the point that complacency and patience are not the same thing. It's important to make an effort. Without effort, nothing happens. Anyway, I went through chemotherapy, 4 months of chemotherapy. I had 2 months of daily radiotherapy, which is a very heavy dose. because my cancer had got into the lymphatic system. So that then makes it very, very difficult indeed to cure, because of course it can spread anywhere from there. But anyway, it seemed to be gotten under control. I was on 3 years of hormone therapy as well. Now, all these treatments, they really are quite severe treatments. I mean, my oncologist mentioned that to me. You had a very severe dose of treatment, but they leave their effects. When I was going through chemotherapy, I was told by one of my friends, an acupuncturist, as it happens, she said, "Devamitra, you do realise this is all aged you?" And I said, "Yes, I have a mirror." I just could see it in my face. In a matter of months, I looked 10 years older, at least. I lost all my hair, of course, which probably made me look a bit older too. It hasn't all completely grown back either. Some of it has, but not all of it. It really felt like I had been sort of projected into a premature old age. In fact, a prostate cancer nurse told me that hormone therapy in particular has that sort of effect, because you get this terrible fatigue in your legs. I mean, for 5 weeks I couldn't walk. I was in a wheelchair for 5 weeks. Fortunately, some of my strength came back. It's never come back completely. But I felt that whole experience brought me into old age. I've lost most of my physical vitality. I used to be very, very fit when I got cancer. I no longer am. I can't swim anymore. I just don't have the energy to do that. I can't cycle easily. I can to some extent, but these things are past me now. And so it was as if old age had come prematurely to me. Not only that, as I mentioned, your body starts to slowly decay in odd little ways, without going into the details of all that again. But it really is a wonderful image that the Buddha chose to describe his own body as an old, worn-out car. You can still move, you can still function, and your mind may be as agile and as alert as ever, but the body is slowly giving way. Now, I'm dwelling upon this for two reasons. First of all, I've encountered sickness. I've been projected into old age, it seems to me. I'd never really given either of those two things serious consideration when I was younger. Of course, we acknowledge them, and of course, when you get a cold, you feel ill, and you can moan and complain about it. It's a good excuse to moan and complain. I don't recommend moaning and complaining about anything, by the way, but I think that's when old age begins. I've got a theory about aging. When you start moaning and complaining, you're getting old. And believe me, it starts young. 25. I hear 25-year-olds complaining and moaning. I said, stop it. You don't know where that's going to lead you. Always wanting things to be right. We got a new kitchen in my community. I don't know how much money they've spent on it. I was perfectly content with the one we already had, but we've now got a super duper kitchen with a cooker. Does anyone know what a cooker is? It's a special tap. You don't even need a kettle anymore. It's like you just put your cup under the tap and the water temperature is 105 degrees apparently. It's very hot. So kettles are no longer needed. Another labor-saving device. And we've got it in my community. But it's so easy to complain. And I think that this is a sign that you're getting old, even if you're 25, because it means that the world isn't quite fitting for you. It's not how you want it to be. That's why people complain. And people are not the way they want to be. That's why you complain about them. And I could see when I was in my 50s that I saw it with one or two of my community members. I was horrified. They were complaining more and more and more, becoming more and more grumpy. And I thought, if I'm not careful, I'm going to end up like that. I'm going to end up a grumpy old man. Perish the thought. I mean, that's death. I'd rather be dead than become a grumpy old man. I've put a lot of effort in not becoming a grumpy old man. I hope I've succeeded. But I made it a rule not to complain about anything if I possibly can. And I've asked my community members, if they catch me at it, to point it out. But Stiramanus very kindly said the other day, said, no, you don't complain, Devamitra. And I think that helps you to stay young, at least mentally, if not in other ways. So that's the first thing I'd like to say about that. So old age creeps on you gradually. You don't think about it when you're young. Well, why should you? Old age is for the old, not for the young. Who wants to think about old age when you're in your 20s or 30s even, or even in your 40s and 50s? But it's important to take cognizance of the fact that one day you will grow old if you aren't already. And once the body starts to give way, it doesn't get any better, I can tell you. It just doesn't. It just slowly gets worse and worse. And you have to face this with the most positive frame of mind that you can. It's a challenge. And it's a challenge which you can rise to. And it's a challenge certainly that, well, it wasn't a challenge for the Buddha. He didn't even need to rise to the challenge. He just could deal with it. I mean, it must have cost him a lot to travel around North India when he was 80, just communicating with different groups of disciples, still concerned about their well-being, wanting to say farewell to them. I think that's such a wonderful story. And then, of course, the Buddha did finally pass away. Even the Buddha passes away. He had to remind Ananda, didn't I say that all conditioned things are subject to impermanence, death and impermanence? We are conditioned things. All sentient creatures are things in a sense, and we're subject to impermanence. Sooner or later we die. But yes, even the Buddha passed away. And we never know, of course, when that's going to happen. And of course, we don't want to think too much about that, because we obviously don't want to get in a morbid state about it. But it's important to remember that one day you will. And one of the things that I have found, especially going through, having had a fairly severe cancer, is that it's right. I can't get away from that. My own mortality I've been confronted by it ever since my diagnosis, actually. It's always there with me. I cannot forget it. And it's the best sort of meditation on death and impermanence that I've had in the course of this life. Many times I've done practices which involve contemplating the impermanence of the human body and so on and so forth, and reflected upon that. But when your life is actually threatened by something in that way, it's a totally different experience, because it hits you in the gut, and you have to confront that. You have to deal with it, face it, let it in. One of the things that I realized pretty quickly when I was diagnosed with cancer was that in order to deal with it in the most positive way, I had to not just acknowledge it, I certainly wasn't going to deny it, but welcome it. Extend a welcome to it in a certain sense. It's part of me. It's my body. It's cells in my body that are doing this to me. Nobody's inflicting this upon me. It's happening within my own body. It happens to many people. It hasn't just happened to me. I've met many people with cancer. I know many people with cancer. Some of them deal with it very positively. Many of them don't. But if you want to sort of deal with it positively, you have to open up completely to it. You have to, in a sense, welcome it in. And this is one of the themes, in a way, in my book. My book is entitled Entertaining Cancer, the Buddhist Way. And it means literally entertaining the cancer, letting it be. Of course, that doesn't mean to say you can't try and get rid of it through treatments. I've certainly done that, but you let the experience in. And also, very, very important, I hope that the book is entertaining. It's full of some very good gags about, though I say so myself. Most people who've read it find it very funny, to their horror. But it's important to retain your sense of humour in difficult circumstances like this. And I never lost mine. In fact, there were moments where I laughed out loud, because when you have a sense of your own mortality, you do perceive things and other people very differently. You see them in a different light. And I remember on one occasion walking in Victoria Park, which is the park very close to the London Buddhist Centre, just watching the people. It was a beautiful summer's day, and their behaviour, even the way that they were dressed, seemed to me to be absolutely absurd. Absurd to the point that I started to laugh. I wasn't laughing at them. I was just so amused by it. I was so amused by the extent to which people feel the urge, the necessity to take selfies. How many selfies can you take in a day? Everywhere you go, people are taking selfies. What are they going to do with all these pictures? I've no idea. I'll probably never even look at them again. Put them on social media and hope that someone says something nice about them. Good luck. But I was just struck by the absurdity of human behavior. It was a source of entertainment to me. You learn to see the funny side of life. I mean, at one point I thought, well, people just don't realize what a huge cosmic joke we're experiencing. And it was not just not just human behavior. I was also amused by the behavior of the animals that I would see in the park, especially the waterfowl, especially the coots, who are particularly quarrelsome creatures. Always a good laugh, always worth a good laugh. So, right, I've got off track somehow. How to get there? Got onto my book. I didn't mean to get onto it so quickly, but yes, coming back to the Buddhist Parinirvana, it really brings home to us the fact that even the enlightened, in a certain sense, are not beyond death. In a sense, they are, because the enlightened, of course, have reached the deathless. But the body that they were born into in this life certainly isn't impermanent, and it does die. And in the Parinirvana Sutta, you have, in fact, I think Lalta Raja read part of this. Anuruddha is able to track the progress of the Buddha's consciousness, as it were. He goes up the dhyanas, right up to the end of the Arupa dhyanas, the highest states of consciousness, let's say the highest possible states of mundane consciousness it's possible to reach, comes back down, eventually right down to the first dhyana, and then disappears. Totally mysterious. This is one of the things that fascinates me about death. It's such a mysterious thing, especially if you watch it when it's happening. And I've done that a few times in my life. And there comes a point where whatever the nurse says, if it's in a hospital, oh, he's dead now. You're not, is he? It doesn't quite seem that straightforward and simple to me. There's a point at which clinical death is reached. But is that what we really mean by death? I suppose in a Buddhist context, what you'd mean would be the point at which consciousness finally separates from the physical body. But it's very difficult to determine when that is. And I remember on one occasion in particular, because I was not emotionally involved with the person that was dying, it was my mother's partner after my father had died. And I was with her when he was dying in A&E. He'd had a severe heart attack. And they tried to resuscitate him and couldn't succeed. And he was just lying in this unit, clearly just minutes away from the moment at which he would be pronounced dead by the medical staff. But it didn't seem to me that he'd gone at the point at which he was, he was declared to be dead. And I couldn't work out at what point you could say he was dead. His body was certainly immobile, he wasn't breathing, but what was going on then? It just seems such a slow, natural, very peaceful, I must say, process. So death still remains a mystery as far as I'm concerned. All we know is that whatever it is, it's going to happen to us. That's the only thing that we know for certainty in this life. Life is uncertain, but that is not. We know that we'll die, we don't know when. But human beings are not very good at living with uncertainty in any context. I remember when I was a young actor, you go for an audition and you wait, not knowing what the outcome's going to be. Will you get the job or won't you? When you've waited a certain amount of time, you know perfectly well they're not coming for you. But even then, sometimes they surprise you and come back. But that period of uncertainty, especially if it's a job you really wanted, was very, very difficult, I found. And I was speaking with one of my community members, I think it was one day last week, and he was saying that he's finding things very difficult at the moment because he didn't know whether he's going to be invited on the forthcoming ordination course this year or not. And I couldn't really talk to him about that, but he said he found the uncertainty of the situation very, very difficult. And I could fully sympathize with that. And I'm very sorry that he was put in that sort of position. But he really was finding it excruciatingly painful, just not knowing. He said, if only I knew one way or the other, I'd be fine. And I think that's very often the way it is with us. It's a bit of a relief sometimes when something which is uncertain goes the way you don't want it to go, because, well, at least you know what the truth of the situation is. And I'm bringing this in at this point because the issue of uncertainty, which we all have to face, is because, as I have always known, my own health is very precarious. My cancer, I'm in remission as far as I'm aware, but my oncologist warned me at the end of radiotherapy that there was a 50% chance it would recur within 5 years. And I had a sense over a period of about 9 months when I was, you get regularly reviewed by your oncologist, your consultant, and about 9 months ago, I got the first hint that something might just be beginning to concern her. And indeed it has. And so I still don't know whether my cancer's recurred, but it might have done. I've got to get various scans in the coming week or two to determine whether that's happened. So I found this very, very interesting because I could sense it coming. I could sense her concern coming anyway. But what I found really interesting was the difference in attitude on this occasion to when I was waiting for 11 weeks the first time around to find out whether or not my cancer had spread to other parts of my body. It took a long time for all these scans and what have you to be done and for them to be analyzed. But I was ready for it. I was quite expecting this to happen. And so there's a possibility it has recurred. It may not have done, by the way. It's absolutely unclear. It's uncertain. But it's the uncertainty of the situation. I mentioned this to my young friend. So, well, think of the uncertainty that I'm living with at the moment. And he said, yeah, I just couldn't handle that. But you can train yourself. You can learn to handle it. Everything in life is uncertain. And when it comes to thinking about, well, terminal disease, I quite often make this little joke. We're all suffering from a terminal disease. It's called life. We all end up dying, whether we like it or not. Anyway, these are some of the things that I think that for me that the Parinirvana suggests, and also my own recent experience has brought very vividly to life for me. And those experiences are recounted very fully in the book that I've written, which Windhorse Publications have kindly agreed to publish, and now it's out, and there are 6 copies downstairs. Good luck if you want to buy it. Forgive me for trying to one or two sort of obligations in one. I hope you won't feel that I've fallen short certainly in commemorating the Buddha's Parinirvana, because certainly that's far more important than promoting one little book that happens to be published, even though I wrote it. So upon that note, let's leave it there.
Thank you, Devamitra. Thank you very much for that. Very heartfelt and direct. And there is, I was just quite struck, that because I've seen you give talks many times since I first saw you, maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The pace of your delivery and the measuredness and it just seems that the patience is really. Oh, sorry, I forgot to keep in there. Yeah, the patience is really something that stood out for me, and both in what you said, but also in the way that you seem to be now. It seems just my impression. So, what time is it?
20 to 1.
20 to 1. Where are we? Lunchtime, I think. Would you like to meet people downstairs, and if people want their book signed, or
If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, please do. If there are none left by the time you get round to it, you can always order online the Windhorse Publications or your local book manager. And of course, I'd be more than happy to sign copies if anyone wants me to do that.
highly recommended.
There are thank yous from the online people. Appreciations.
Thank you.
Question. I was just sorry. Is it okay to ask?
I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, okay, good. You mentioned that you surprised yourself by maintaining a very positive state of mind during the time that you were having your chemo. What, I'm just wondering what do you? I know you mentioned your practice helped, and there was a cumulative effect of that over time. And so what I just wondered if there was anything else that helped sustain that. Was that just purely your past practice, or was there anything else that maybe
No.
you
Of course, no, it wasn't just my past practice,
Right.
but that was a significant part.
Yes.
I was living in very, very supportive conditions.
Okay.
I had very good friends around me in my community who couldn't do enough for me to help me during that whole period. And even now they have to do things for me. I mean, not as much as that period, but of course it helps enormously if you've got supportive conditions and if you're living with good friends. I feel blessed in that way. Very few people have such supportive conditions. I know, because I've talked with people who've had cancer who are living on their own. It's a nightmare for them. I don't know what to say. I don't know I don't know what you can do for them. If you know of anyone in that situation, by the way, you can always go and spend some time with them, even if you don't talk. I mean, just a warm human presence goes a long way. So I was very, very fortunate in that respect, because for 2.5 years, not long before I moved into Sakavati, I had nowhere to live. The Majjhima came to an end, and I couldn't find a community to move into. Fortunately, in the end, someone at Sakavati was very keen to get me there, so I moved in. And a year later, I was diagnosed with the cancer. But I don't know what would have happened had I not got a commuter at that time. It would have been much more difficult. I hope that I would have been able to maintain my vision and sustain my positive mental states. But of course, it's much more difficult when you're in unsupportive conditions, which is the case for probably the vast majority of people. I'm sorry to say, I'm very sad about that, but it's just the way it is. I think so. I think it might be worth saying something else, which was that throughout that whole period, I continued teaching at the LBC. Stephen Mann said, he go online the other day, I didn't know this by the way, but he bumped into someone in the park a few days earlier who just mentioned that this book had been published, and they were talking a little bit about me, and apparently this person, who I don't know who he was, said to Stephen Mann, yeah, he said, some of Devamitra's talks at that time were wild. I don't know, I was not on the receiving end of them. I certainly had a lot of fun. And that actually helped, being able to go down and teach, even in the middle of a chemo, you've got the chemo brain, which is not, when the brain doesn't quite function as well as you'd like it to. I was able to somehow articulate something. I think people appreciated my talks at that time more for effort than content. They didn't stop me, which is great. Yeah.
I wondered, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
I was just wondering how much focusing on writing the book has been supportive to you.
Oh, it was actually, I've forgotten about that. It was a major support because I would drag myself to my desk every day. Sometimes I really hardly had the physical energy to do just that, and make sure I wrote something. And sometimes, I'd spend a morning just writing and trying to make sense of one sentence, or trying to catch something that was elusive. And my chemo-affected brain, not to mention my testosterone-starved brain, which also is important didn't have any testosterone in my body because it's been suppressed by the hormone therapy. And you need that for a healthy functioning brain. My brain was in a haze, and to write under those circumstances wasn't easy. But nonetheless, I did manage to write something, and that's all in the book. The bulk of what I wrote was written at the time I went through chemotherapy and radiotherapy. And the rest was, it's just slowly added to. But it was a support because I was able to objectify my experience. That's what writing does. It helps you to see things much more clearly. I really wanted to get a clear understanding of what was going on, what I really felt. I don't just mean physically, but also mentally, emotionally. Work it out, because it wasn't clear to me. And the writing was a great help in that, and therefore a great support to getting through the treatments. It's not so much about getting through the cancer. I mean, it's getting through the treatments. I've never had any trouble from the cancer. I've never had any pain from the cancer. It's the treatments and their terrible side effects, many of which are still with me. And then you reach a point of thinking, is it worth it? I did have that thought several times, and even after the treatments. And it's a continual tension, actually. Is it really worth it? Because what you're weighing up is length of life against, arguably, quality of life. And that's a tension that I'm having to deal with right now. What do? Do I get more treatment? I've told my oncologist, no more chemo. She mentioned chemo, and I said, no, I'm not doing that again. So that limits your options. But the other options are not particularly appealing either. So what do? Do I just say, okay, that's going to be the end of that? Just let nature take its course? I'd rather have a short period of a reasonable quality of life than a much longer period where I've got yet more side effects from cancer treatments to deal with. where my body becomes even weaker as a consequence of undergoing them. But I can live another 10 years or so. That's a possibility. And you have to weigh that up against other considerations. I've reached a stage of my life where, at long last, some people at least, seem to think I've got some experience worth that they can learn from, and they can benefit from. So I have to take that into account. What's most important? Do I try to live as long as I can, to give of my experience? Or do I just say, sorry, I can't, I've had enough of this, I'm just going to let the whole thing run out? And that's not an easy one to resolve, actually. I think that the desire to, in some way, give others whatever little experience I've gained in this life, which may be a benefit to them, has been the main thing which has seen me through. In a sense, that's been a kind of support, you could say. But it's the main thrust of my life at the moment. But in the end, sooner or later, you just got to bite a bullet, fall off your perch, whatever. We've gone over time, but I mean, maybe you, Anna, you had a question. Do you want to?
I did.
It's quick, I can.
You mentioned that we can learn to handle uncertainty.
Yeah.
Were there any teachings or any techniques that you used in that process?
No, it's just pure experience. You know, if you live with uncertainty for long enough, you get used to it. You become habituated to it, and somehow let it not sort of, what would you say, will destabilize you in any way. That's not the right word, but it doesn't trouble me. I'm not bothered. I mean, about, you know, I've got these 2 scans in the next week or 2. I'm not worrying about what the results will be. They'll be what they will be, and I'll deal with it. But it's taken me a long time. I suppose it's slowly you develop a certain amount of equanimity. But I think it's the fact of having to deal with that sort of background uncertainty for so long. I've had to deal with it so many times, it just ceases to trouble you. But that's in extreme circumstances for me that's come about. I mean, the best thing you can do always is develop positive emotion. That's the best solution to all of this. Do lots of metta and act out of it. Maybe we better stop there.